your feelings. Instead of internalizing a bad situation, externalize it and face your enemy. It is the only way out. The child psychologist Jean Piaget saw conflict as a critical part of mental development. Through battles with peers and then parents, children learn to adapt to the world and develop strategies for dealing with problems. Those children who seek to avoid conflict at all cost, or those who have overprotective parents, end up handicapped socially and mentally. The same is true of adults. It is through your battles with others that you learn what works, what doesn't, and how to protect yourself. Instead of shrinking from the idea of having enemies, then embrace it. Conflict is therapeutic. Enemies bring many gifts. For one thing, they motivate you and focus your beliefs. The artist Salvador Dali found early on that there were many qualities he could not stand in people: conformity, romanticism, piety. At every stage of his life, he found someone he thought embodied these anti-ideals, an enemy to vent on. First, it was the poet Federico Garcia Lorca, who wrote romantic poetry. Then it was André Breton, the heavy-handed leader of the Surrealist movement. Having such enemies to rebel against made Dali feel confident and inspired. Enemies also give you a standard by which to judge yourself, both personally and socially. The samurai of Japan had no gauge of their excellence unless they fought the best swordsman. It took Joe Frazier to make Muhammad Ali a truly great fighter. A tough opponent will bring out the best in you, and the bigger the opponent, the greater your reward, even in defeat. It is better to lose to a worthy opponent than to squash some harmless foe. You will gain sympathy and respect, building support for your next fight. Being attacked is a sign that you are important enough to be a target. You should relish the attention and the chance to prove yourself. We all have aggressive impulses that we are forced to repress. An enemy supplies you with an outlet for these drives. At last, you have someone on whom to unleash your aggression without feeling guilty. Leaders have always found it useful to have an enemy at their gates in times of trouble, distracting the public from their difficulties. In using your enemies to rally your troops, polarize them as far as possible. They will fight the more fiercely when they feel a little hatred. So exaggerate the differences between you and the enemy. Draw the lines clearly. Xenophon made no effort to be fair. He did not say that the Persians weren't really such a bad lot and had done much to advance civilization. He called them barbarians, the antithesis of the Greeks. He described their recent treachery and said they were an evil culture that could find no favor with the gods. And so it is with you. Victory is your goal, not fairness and balance. Use the rhetoric of war to heighten the stakes and stimulate the spirit. What you want in warfare is room to maneuver. Tight corners spell death. Having enemies gives you options. You can play them off against each other. Make one a friend as a way of attacking the other, on and on. Without enemies, you will not know how or where to maneuver, and you will lose a sense of your limits, of how far you can go. Early on, Julius Caesar identified Pompey as his enemy. Measuring his actions and calculating carefully, he did only those things that left him in a solid position in relation to Pompey. When war finally broke out between the two men, Caesar was at his best. But once he defeated Pompey and had no more such rivals, he lost all sense of proportion. In fact, he fancied himself a god. His defeat of Pompey was his own undoing. Your enemies force on you a sense of realism and humility. Remember, there are always people out there who are more aggressive, more devious, more ruthless than you are, and it is inevitable that some of them will cross your path. You will have a tendency to want to conciliate and compromise with them. The reason is that such types are often brilliant deceivers who see the strategic value in charm or in seeming to allow you plenty of space, but actually their desires have no limit and they are simply trying to disarm you. With some people, you have to harden yourself to recognize that there is no middle ground, no hope of conciliation. For your opponent, Your desire to compromise is a weapon to use against you. Know these dangerous enemies by their past. Look for quick power grabs, sudden rises in fortune, previous acts of treachery. Once you suspect you are dealing with a Napoleon, do not lay down your arms or entrust them to someone else. You are the last line of your own defense. Reversal. Always keep the search for and use of enemies under control. It is clarity you want, not paranoia. It is the downfall of many tyrants to see an enemy in everyone. They lose their grip on reality and become hopelessly embroiled in the emotions their paranoia churns up. By keeping an eye on possible enemies, you are simply being prudent and cautious. Keep your suspicions to yourself, so that if you're wrong, no one will know. Also, beware of polarizing people so completely that you cannot back off. Margaret Thatcher, usually brilliant at the polarizing game, eventually lost control of it. She created too many enemies and kept repeating the same tactic, even in situations that called for retreat. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a master polarizer, always looking to draw a line between himself and his enemies. Once he had made that line clear enough, though, he backed off, which made him look like a conciliator, a man of peace, who occasionally went to war. Even if that impression was false, it was the height of wisdom to create it. Here are further reflections on the strategy of polarity. From Anabasis, The March Up Country, by Xenophon. Then Xenophon got up and first called together the under-officers of Proxenus. When they were collected, he said, "Gentlemen, I cannot sleep, and I don't think you can. And I can't lie here when I see what a plight we are in. It is clear that the enemy did not show us open war until they thought they had everything well prepared, and no one among us takes the pains to make the best possible resistance. Yet if we give way and fall into the king's power, what do we expect our fate will be? When his own half-brother was dead, the man cut off his head and cut off his hand and stuck them up on a pole. We have no one to plead for us, and we marched here to make the king a slave or to kill him if we could, and what do you think our fate will be? Would he not go to all extremes of torture to make the whole world afraid of making war on him? Why, we must do anything to keep out of his power. While the truce lasted, I never ceased pitying ourselves. I never ceased congratulating the king and his army. What a vast country I saw! How large! What endless provisions! What crowds of servants! How many cattle and sheep! What gold! What raiment! But when I thought of these, our soldiers, we had no share in all these good things unless we bought them, and few had anything left to buy with. And to procure anything without buying was debarred by our oaths. While I reasoned like this, I sometimes feared the truce more than the war now. However, now they have broken the truce. There is an end both to their insolence and to our suspicion. There lie all these good things before us, prizes for whichever side prove the better men. The gods are the judges of the contest, and they will be with us naturally. When you have appointed as many commanders as are wanted, assemble all the other soldiers and encourage them. That will be just what they want now. Perhaps you have noticed yourselves how crestfallen they were when they came into camp, how crestfallen they went on guard. In such a state, I don't know what you could do with them, but if someone could turn their minds from wondering what will happen to them and make them wonder what they could do, they will be much more cheerful. You know, I am sure that not numbers or strength brings victory in war, but whichever army goes into battle stronger in soul, their enemies generally cannot withstand them. By Carl Schmitt. Political thought and political instinct prove themselves theoretically and practically in the ability to distinguish friend and enemy. The high points of politics are simultaneously the moments in which the enemy is, in concrete clarity, recognized as the enemy. By Friedrich Nietzsche. I am by nature warlike. To attack is among my instincts. To be able to be an enemy, that presupposes a strong nature. It is in any event a condition of every strong nature. It needs resistances. Consequently, it seeks resistances. The strength of one who attacks has in the opposition he needs a kind of gauge. Every growth reveals itself in the seeking out of a powerful opponent or problem. For a philosopher who is warlike also challenges problems to a duel. The undertaking is to master not any resistances that happen to present themselves, but those against which one has to bring all one's strength, suppleness, and mastery of weapons. To master equal opponents. From The Persistence of Memory, a biography of Dali, by Meredith Etherington Smith. Salvador Dali had no time for those who did not agree with his principles, and took the war into the enemy camp by writing insulting letters to many of the friends he had made in the Residencia, calling them pigs. He happily compared himself to a clever bull, avoiding the cowboys, and generally had a great deal of fun stirring up and scandalizing almost every Catalan intellectual worthy of the name. Dali was beginning to burn his bridges with the zeal of an arsonist. We, Dali and the filmmaker Luis Buñuel, had resolved to send a poisoned pen letter to one of the great celebrities of Spain, Dali later told his biographer Alain Bousquet. Our goal was pure subversion. Both of us were strongly influenced by Nietzsche. We hit upon two names, Manuel de Falla, the composer, and Juan Ramón Jiménez, the poet. We drew straws and Jiménez won. So we composed a frenzied and nasty letter of incomparable violence and addressed it to Juan Ramón Jiménez. It read, Our distinguished friend, we believe it is our duty to inform you, disinterestedly, that your work is deeply repugnant to us because of its immorality, its hysteria, its arbitrary quality. It caused Jiménez great pain. By Georg Simmel. The opposition of a member to an associate is no purely negative social factor, if only because such opposition is often the only means for making life with actually unbearable people at least possible. If we did not even have the power and the right to rebel against tyranny, arbitrariness, moodiness, tactlessness, we could not bear to have any relation to people from whose characters we thus suffer. We would feel pushed to take desperate steps, and these indeed would end the relation, but do not perhaps constitute conflict. Not only because of the fact that oppression usually increases if it is suffered calmly and without protest, but also because opposition gives us inner satisfaction, distraction, relief. Our opposition makes us feel that we are not completely victims of the circumstances. By William McDougall. As one travels up any one of the large rivers of Borneo, one meets with tribes that are successively more warlike. In the coast regions are peaceful communities which never fight save in self-defense, and then with but poor success. Whereas in the central regions, where the rivers take their rise, are a number of extremely warlike tribes whose raids have been a constant source of terror to the communities settled in the lower reaches of the rivers. It might be supposed that the peaceful coast people would be found to be superior in moral qualities to their more warlike neighbors, but the contrary is the case. In almost all respects, the advantage lies with the warlike tribes. Their houses are better built, larger, and cleaner. Their domestic morality is superior. They are physically stronger, are braver, and physically and mentally more active, and in general are more trustworthy. But above all, their social organization is firmer and more efficient, because their respect for and obedience to their chiefs and their loyalty to their community are much greater. Each man identifies himself with the whole community and accepts and loyally performs the social duties laid upon him. By Georg Hegel. Man exists only insofar as he is opposed. And lastly, from My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass. The frequent hearing of my mistress reading the Bible, for she often read aloud when her husband was absent, soon awakened my curiosity in respect to this mystery of reading, and roused in me the desire to learn. Having no fear of my kind mistress before my eyes, she had given me no reason to fear, I frankly asked her to teach me to read. And without hesitation the dear woman began the task, and very soon, by her assistance, I was master of the alphabet, and could spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Master Hugh was amazed at the simplicity of his spouse, and probably for the first time, he unfolded to her the true philosophy of slavery, and the peculiar rules necessary to be observed by masters and mistresses in the management of their human chattels. Mr. Auld promptly forbade the continuance of her reading instruction, telling her, in the first place, that the thing itself was unlawful, that it was also unsafe, and could only lead to mischief. Mrs. Auld evidently felt the force of his remarks, and, like an obedient wife, began to shape her course in the direction indicated by her husband. The effect of his words on me was neither slight nor transitory. His iron sentences, cold and harsh, sunk deep into my heart, and stirred up not only my feelings into a sort of rebellion, but awakened within me a slumbering train of vital thought. It was a new and special revelation, dispelling a painful mystery against which my youthful understanding had struggled, and struggled in vain, to wit, the white man's power to perpetuate the enslavement of the black man. Very well, thought I, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. I instinctively assented to the proposition, and from that moment I understood the direct pathway from slavery to freedom. This was just what I needed, and got it at a time and from a source whence I least expected it. Wise as Mr. Auld was, he evidently underrated my comprehension, and had little idea of the use to which I was capable of putting the impressive lesson he was giving to his wife. That which he most loved, I most hated, and the very determination which he expressed to keep me in ignorance only rendered me the more resolute in seeking intelligence. Chapter 2. Do not fight the last war. The guerrilla war of the mind strategy. What most often weighs you down and brings you misery is the past, in the form of unnecessary attachments, repetitions of tired formulas, and the memory of old victories and defeats. You must consciously wage war against the past and force yourself to react to the present moment. Be ruthless on yourself. Do not repeat the same tired methods. Sometimes you must force yourself to strike out in new directions, even if they involve risk. What you may lose in comfort and security, you will gain in surprise, making it harder for your enemies to tell what you will do. Wage guerrilla war on your mind, allowing no static lines of defense, no exposed citadels. Make everything fluid and mobile. The last war. No one has risen to power faster than Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. In 1793, he went from captain in the French Revolutionary Army to brigadier general. In 1796, he became the leader of the French force in Italy fighting the Austrians, whom he crushed that year and again 3 years later. He became first consul of France in 1801, emperor in 1804. In 1805, he humiliated the Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz. For many, Napoleon was more than a great general. He was a genius, a god of war. Not everyone was impressed, though. There were Prussian generals who thought he had merely been lucky. Where Napoleon was rash and aggressive, they believed, his opponents had been timid and weak. If he ever faced the Prussians, he would be revealed as a great fake. Among these Prussian generals was Friedrich Ludwig, Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen, 1746 to 1818. Hohenlohe came from one of Germany's oldest aristocratic families, one with an illustrious military record. He had begun his career young, serving under Frederick the Great, 1712 to 86, himself the man who had single-handedly made Prussia a great power. Hohenlohe had risen through the ranks, becoming a general at 50, young by Prussian standards. To Hohenlohe, success in war depended on organization, discipline, and the use of superior strategies developed by trained military minds. The Prussians exemplified all of these virtues. Prussian soldiers drilled relentlessly until they could perform elaborate maneuvers as precisely as a machine. Prussian generals intensely studied the victories of Frederick the Great. War for them was a mathematical affair, the application of timeless principles. To the generals, Napoleon was a Corsican hothead leading an unruly citizens' army. Superior in knowledge and skill, they would out-strategize him. The French would panic and crumble in the face of the disciplined Prussians. The Napoleonic myth would lie in ruins, and Europe could return to its old ways. In August 1806, Hohenlohe and his fellow generals finally got what they wanted. King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, tired of Napoleon's broken promises, decided to declare war on him in 6 weeks. In the meantime, he asked his generals to come up with a plan to crush the French. Hohenlohe was ecstatic. This campaign would be the climax of his career. He had been thinking for years about how to beat Napoleon, and he presented his plan at the generals' first strategy session. Precise marches would place the army at the perfect angle from which to attack the French as they advanced through southern Prussia. An attack in oblique formation, Frederick the Great's favorite tactic, would deliver a devastating blow. The other generals, all in their 60s and 70s, presented their own plans, but these too were merely variants on the tactics of Frederick the Great. Discussion turned into argument. Several weeks went by. Finally, the king had to step in and create a compromise strategy that would satisfy all of his generals. A feeling of exuberance swept the country, which would soon relive the glory years of Frederick the Great. The generals realized that Napoleon knew about their plans. He had excellent spies. But the Prussians had a head start, and once their war machine started to move, nothing could stop it. On October 5th, a few days before the king was to declare war, disturbing news reached the generals. A reconnaissance mission revealed that divisions of Napoleon's army, which they had believed was dispersed, had marched east, merged, and was massing deep in southern Prussia. The captain who had led the scouting mission reported that the French soldiers were marching with packs on their backs. Where the Prussians used slow-moving wagons to provision their troops, the French carried their own supplies and moved with astonishing speed and mobility. Before the generals had time to adjust their plans, Napoleon's army suddenly wheeled north, heading straight for Berlin, the heart of Prussia. The generals argued and dithered, moving their troops here and there, trying to decide where to attack. A mood of panic set in. Finally, the king ordered a retreat. The troops would reassemble to the north and attack Napoleon's flank as he advanced toward Berlin. Hohenlohe was in charge of the rear guard, protecting the Prussians' retreat.